Here we go. So we're kind of like gonna go smack dab in the middle of the book of Esther. So we've done Esther 1 and 2. And sorry guys, it's kind of slipped in my mind. I forgot to post the last couple of videos, but I'll do it here this weekend. Um but we'll just this is going to start with a time where we've already come to gotten through the part where Esther had fasted. And so if you're looking in the story, remember the first time I showed you guys kind of like how the Bible Project had sort of diagrammed the story out. This is just kind of like the bottom and the middle of the diagram. But if you remember it, it's a chiasm. In other words, it's a parallel structure. So that when we get here, and we're going to do chapter 6 today, we're going to do 5, 6, 7, maybe 8. We'll see how far we get. But the a chiastic structure is basically where you have parallel structures, and often there's kind of parallel contrasting structure. So you have, if you have the downfall of somebody here, you have the uprising of somebody on the other side. If you have, but these are all kind of parallel. So sandwiched right between this time where Mordecai, we're going to see Mordecai being lifted up. In other words, and what we saw first was Haman being lifted up, and now you see Mordecai being lifted up and Haman falling. So that's sandwiched right between two banquet stories. And then when you look at like 4 and 8, you have that Mordecai and Esther start thinking about what they can do to turn the decree around and not have all the Jews killed. And then you'll see that paralleled on the other side. It's out of the view of the window, but right here where you have the little arrows, over here you're supposed to have, over here you would have the gallows that Haman builds to hang Mordecai on. And then on the other side of that, you would have Haman hung on his own gallows, or actually skewered on that pole. So you would have so it's a parallel structure. So once we get through this part right here, we'll start talking a little bit about how there's some parallel wording, and it's going to refer back to the places where it parallels to. But this is the pivot point right here, is where Mordecai is lifted up. So starting in chapter 5, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. So he has a palace where he lives, but he's got a throne room that overlooks his own palace. But there's a note here on the third day. There's something that you're going to notice in a lot of Old Testament passages where you have a third day, where it seems to be related to some sort of a resurrection event, right? So of course, for us Christians, we know that Christ was risen on the third day, but it was the same thing with Jonah being spit out of the belly of the beast when he was, like he came out of the fish onto dry land. And that whole chapter 2 of Jonah, when he's in the belly of the monster, that's kind of a death experience to him. So if you read Jonah 2, and you read all about how the gates of the bars of Sheol enclosed him, and he has all of this death language in it. So third day, this is kind of a note that I got out of a study Bible, but it's a resurrection kind of a language. So you could put it this way, that Esther, she finally comes out of 3 days of fasting, and it's almost kind of like a death because death has been decreed on her people. And she has the statement right before she goes into a fast. And she says, if I die, I die, right? And then she goes into a fast. But after the third day, she puts on royal garments. Now, this is in contrast to Mordecai's sackcloth. So you had sackcloth and ashes, people mourning. After Mordecai, people fasting 3 days. And then, but then after 3 days, she rises up and she's going to start and she's going to rise up to defeat the enemies of God and provide salvation. She's going to be the tool of salvation for the Jewish people, And so just as Jesus would rise on third day as king and overthrow the enemies of God. So it's a little bit of third day language there. And when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Now, the risk that Esther is taking here is that if he doesn't extend the scepter to her, she's dead, right? You couldn't it was illegal for you just to kind of come before the king. At least it was illegal in the sense that if you did that uninvited, you risked him not accepting your appearance, and then you would be put to death, right? It says, then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, which is interesting here. Because it doesn't say that the second time that the scepter is now there is nothing that I found where this is significant, okay? Like where touching the tip of the scepter was a custom or anything like that. I'm the only reason I'm going to bring this up here is because of something else that I'm going to show you. But this could be a little bit of let's just say adult theme kind of going on here. And it has to do a little bit with the king's sensuality and the way that he sees Esther. And I wouldn't even bring it up except for that there's kind of some parallels in a New Testament story that I'm going to show you with King Herod. And the king said to her, "What is?" Because the whole story is filled with like parties and drunkenness and beautiful women and actually lust and things like that. Now I wouldn't call it lust because they are married. But it's kind of like this is a king who's very influenced by those sorts of things. He's influenced by, like through his belly. He's influenced through the wine that he drinks. He's influenced by the women he likes to look at, or at least Esther, so he's influenced by those things. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." And so this is a king who's easily manipulated by people, telling him something that is, he's always taken advice from people, and it always seems like he's being manipulated one way or another. And frankly, Esther in a way has her charms and, like manipulates him, but in a good way and for good cause. So if we go to Mark 6, this is where Herod wants to, he's looking for an excuse to kill John, but he knows that John is seen as a prophet by the people and he doesn't want to cause an uproar because John is too popular. So he's just keeping him in prison, right? And here in verse 21, it says, but an opportunity came, in other words, an opportunity to actually kill John, when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. This sounds a little bit like the banquets that Xerxes had for his officials and important people, right? For when Herodias's daughter, so he's he's illegitimately married, married to this woman named Herodias. And the reason that John's in prison is because he's spoken out against Herod marrying her and says this is illegitimate, you shouldn't do this. And that's why Herod doesn't like John. Okay, that's why he's put him in prison. But Herodias's daughter came in and danced, and she pleased Herod and his guests. So it's another kind of like probably sensually oriented sort of thing. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." So this whole thing of and he's going to ask. He says, and he vows to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom." This is only said here and in Esther throughout Scripture. So this is kind of like one of those connecting points, right? And she went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." So here again, you have another king who's easily manipulated by his own, lusts, by his own, persuasiveness to, somebody who he, who's pleased him or whatever. And so I don't know what to make all of that. I never really found any notes that much about it, but I did take note that these are the only times in the Bible where you have this kind of a language, and I do see some parallels there. So she's going to, ask the king out of all the things up to half the kingdom, she's actually going to ask him first for a banquet, a party, right? So verses 4 through 8. And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I prepared for the king." Now, this is kind of as opposed to Vashti, the queen that the king had demoted. Vashti, she had a banquet for the women, but she'd never, so this is a little bit in contrast to that. Esther's like, she's not like Vashti. She's like, why don't I invite the king to a banquet? So he's probably thinking, wow, Vashti wasn't throwing me a party, and so he really likes Esther now. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do Esther's bidding," whatever's Esther has suggested. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is this: if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So tomorrow I'll ask you for the thing I really want. And Haman, he went out that day joyful and glad of heart. Of course, he's got a buzz going on. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. So you have this situation here where Mordecai apparently is sitting down and he won't get up. He won't put. It's not even a matter of bowing, right? He's just not going to give Mordecai any kind of respect. So this kind of leans me a little bit more to the, like away from the side of, that it wasn't a problem that, like he thought like as a Jew, he shouldn't be bowing to anybody but God. But of course, rising for somebody, that's kind of a normal thing you do around royalty or people who are, like way up in an administration, like you rise for a judge. So I think this kind of bolsters my idea that really the problem is that Haman is an Agagite. In other words, he's from the Amalekites, who are a traditional enemy of the Jewish people, and therefore he's like, no, this is an enemy of God, and I'm not going to rise for him. I think it is a like a this people kind of thing. So of course Haman's filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself, so he doesn't do anything about it right then. And he went home and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches. Oh, I've got all this money, and look at me, and like all this stuff that I have. The number of his sons, of course, that's kind of considered riches as well. All the promotions which the king had honored him with. He thinks he's just such a hot shot, and how he advanced him above the princes. I'm going to use, there's different, I keep on using these princes language like the King James does, because I'm going to bring up something later. I'll just kind of leave that. But he's the chief of the princes. That's kind of like where I'm getting at. And you'll see why that's important later. And the servants of the king. So then Haman said, even Queen Esther let no one but me come to the king to the feast she prepared. I was the only guest there besides her and the king. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He's just so living in Mordecai's head that despite all the honor that he thinks is being bestowed on him, he's just it just negates everything. It's kind of like the way we are, right? Where we can't even accept something just because one person's opinion about us or something, so he can't let this go. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made. That's really high. That's like 60 feet, 60 feet high. And in the morning, let the king tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. So they're saying, you know what? In the morning, just go over to the citadel and tell the king that you're going to do this. In other words, like have the king order it. So have already made these gallows, but he can't. He doesn't have the authority to do it. He's got to go to the king and say, hey, I built these gallows, have this guy hung on it because he won't stand to me, right? So in the Septuagint, it actually says Mordecai was to be hanged on a tree, which is interesting. So the Septuagint has some details that, that they cut down a tree and that they were, and they said, let Mordecai be hung on a tree. I think that's I think that's pretty cool language, actually. So then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. On that night, the king could not sleep. So this is all happening on this night. King can't get to sleep that night. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were to be read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold and who sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So Xerxes is learning now how somebody named Mordecai had uncovered a plot to have him killed. In other words, he saved his life, right? He doesn't remember this somehow. But this passage right here is used by the church fathers to show that the Lord plans out his salvation even for those through those who do not believe. So even though this king is not a believer, the Lord is working in the background here to keep him awake where he can't sleep, and then have something read that incidentally falls on this recollection of how this Mordecai person has saved his life. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's wondering, has anything been done for this guy? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And the king said, who is in the court? So this is in the morning, right? He's been up all night, and he's having all this stuff read. Maybe he's trying to look for maybe he's trying to have something read to him so he'll get sleepy, or maybe he's just like, well, while I'm while I'm up, I may as well like you know, do something I've been meaning to do for a while and kind of go through some records, or I don't know what's up with him. Something for some reason he wants, these things read. But anyway, now it's morning and he goes, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the court. So Haman's there first thing in the morning because he wants permission to hang Mordecai, right? Um, Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and before you can say anything about hanging this Mordecai guy, he would have been a dead guy on the spot anyway if he had. But Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" So obviously he's talking about Mordecai here. And Haman said to himself, "Who would the king delight to honor more than me?" So he thinks that the king must be, about to honor him. And Haman said to the king, "For the man in whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king himself has worn." So he wants to wear the king's clothes. This is really audacious. "And the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set." So he's um he's asking for, I mean, this is extremely bold. It's like, let him wear your own clothes and ride your own horse. That's tall, man. That's a tall order. So Haman's delusion, so Alter kind of talks about that. Haman's delusion of grandeur bring him dangerously close to claiming the throne for himself. As Midrash properly recognizes, of course, remember Alter's Jewish, right? He wants raiment, horse, and a crown that are not merely regal, but that the king actually used, thus putting himself in metonymic contact with the body of the king, in a way becoming the king. So he's almost like he wants himself to be portrayed as a king of sorts, or kind of like as the king. All this royal grandeur, of course, will be accorded instead to his enemy Mordecai. So Mordecai is going to be dressed up as if he's almost like a king, right? Well, this is almost kind of like uh, this is almost like the well, I'll mention this later. So let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress. So this is Haman continuing with what should be done for this person. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." So here we have the exaltation of Mordecai, because it's not going to happen to Haman. Haman's going to have to lead Mordecai around on a horse instead. Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." So here you already have like that. As soon as this has happened, you already have that parallel. All of these details right here are we had just heard right before Mordecai, right before this event starts happening, right? So here we're going to start seeing more parallels to the pivot point before this event. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh. So now he's back talking with his wife and the wise men that he was consulting with before the party, right? So here's another kind of like sort of a parallel. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. So now they are recognizing that Haman has begun to fall. So this is kind of like where you have the beginning of the fall of Haman. Now think about that. Once the king figures out that Mordecai is one of the people that Haman wanted to have slaughtered, Haman is in deep trouble. So, he doesn't even know that, he doesn't know at this point even that Esther is a Jew. But once it's kind of like, he knows about this decree to kill all the Jews, right? And if he finds out that Mordecai is one of these Jews and Mordecai is the one who saved his life, that's going to be bad name for Haman, when bad news for Haman. It doesn't even really have to get that far. So they're starting to recognize that like if this Mordecai is a Jew, then yeah, Haman, you're screwed because eventually the king's going to put two and two together. So while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared for the king. I think that's what it says. It had prepared, yeah. So the king and Haman went to the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, I mean, can you imagine like how tense that would be? But anyway, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. So there's that half of my kingdom sort of thing, right? Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. So she's gone, I would like for me and the rest of my people to live. That's what I would that's what I'm requesting. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and to be killed and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. So she's saying, I wouldn't even have brought this up if we were just going to be sold into slavery, because even if we're afflicted to that degree, it's not to be compared to the loss to the king. Now that sounds kind of weird, but here's a couple things that we're not even considering probably. First of all, Jameson Fawcett Brown, they pointed out that though it's a great calamity to the Jews if they would have been sold into slavery, the enslavement of that people might have enriched the national treasury. In other words, they, like the king would have still had income and it could have been contributed to the national treasury. But Benson points out that Haman's 10,000 talents would not repair the king's loss in customs and tributes. That's one thing, right? So, you're going to wipe out a whole group of people who pay their taxes every year. That's not good. Not on an economic level, which the king receives from the Jews with his dominions, nor the injury of his kingdom would sustain by the loss of so many industrious hands out of it. In other words, these are people who are working too. So, that's another, the gross national product is going to go down. So to persecute good people is impolitic, in other words, it's bad politics, right? As it is impious and a manifest wrong to the interest of princes and states, which are weakened and impoverished by it. So that's why she's saying again, like I wouldn't have brought this up if we were going to be sold into slavery because that's still economically feasible. But if you're going to just wipe out a whole bunch of people who are not causing any problems. They're being industrious, and they pay their taxes and everything. That's a loss to you, you know. So she's appealing to like just the gut level, how much money can he make off of these people, right? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? Who did this?" So this guy loses track of everything, can't remember who saved his life, can't remember who passed this, just trying to pass this law to kill all these Jews and everything. He's kind of like he needs to have more sleepless nights where his people read to him, I think. And where is he? Who's dared to do this? And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." And the Haman was terrified before the king and queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking, and he went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. So he knows that the king's out there, fuming, and that he's trying to decide what he's going to do to Haman for this. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. So this falling language is again like where his wife, uh, you know, predicted to him, that you have begun to fall. It's the same kind of wording there. So now he's falling to save his life. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. So, a couple things here. First, I think it seems that Ahasuerus seems to be looking for more reasons to kill Haman because it'd be hard to imagine that like with all of that and this guy's about to lose his life. I go into the garden, you come back, and then he's trying to seduce the queen. Um, you know, it, it seems to me like he would be looking for an excuse. But Alter brings up something, and I think it's worth consideration. He says, one should also keep in mind that to sexually possess the king's consort is to lay claim to the throne, just as Absalom does in cohabiting with David's concubines on the palace roof in view of the people. In other words, this is a thing in the ancient world where sleeping with somebody's wife, you is an attempt at taking over the family household, like the patristic position, or their kingdom, or that sort of thing. I'm not going to go into it, but that's apparently what Ham was trying to do by sleeping with Noah's wife, or which is uncovering someone's naked. In Leviticus, there's a verse about do not sleep with your father's wife. That is she is your father's nakedness. So uncovering your father's nakedness in Leviticus is to sleep with your father's wife. So apparently that could have been what Ham was doing. And the way that Noah figures out what has gone on is because Canaan is born out of that. And that's why Noah curses not Ham for this, but he curses Canaan. So that's it's a possibility that's some of the funky stuff that's going on there in that part of Genesis. But anyway, you see this several times in Scripture where you're trying to take over somebody's reign and authority by sleeping with their mate, right? So it's not out of the question that that now this isn't what's going on. It's just that I'm saying that Xerxes could interpret it this way, possibly legitimately, going, "Oh, now he's trying to do this," but who knows? The Macedonians and the Romans. Okay, so this whole thing about covering Haman's face. It says the Macedonians and the Romans are known to have commonly muffled the heads of the prisoners before executing them. it's kind of, yeah, I mean, we see that like in the Middle Ages too, right? You know, you before you're gonna chop off somebody's head, or like I think we even did, yeah, in the States we did that too with hangings, you know, like you put something over their head, but that's kind of like a thing. It may have also been a Persian custom. So then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." So they basically, this is one of those situations where it's kind of like the servants in the house know what's going on in the house and around the house better than the people that own the place. I don't know if you've ever watched like some of these things where, the servants of these, you know, uh, high-ranking people, lords and ladies. It's always like the butler who knows what's going on. And even the maids know what are going on in that house rather than the elites who live in the home, right? But they're like, yeah, this guy, he built a gallows out there, and he is purported from Mordecai, whose words saved the king. In other words, like, we know about all this, we know about this whole assassination plot. We know, we don't really get to talk to the king, but now they get to talk to the king, and they're saying, yeah, this guy actually he built a gallows for this guy Mordecai, and it's standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. It's like, and the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. Anyway, how are you guys? Because I could do one more chapter, but I can also stop right here. You want to keep going? Okay. Okay. We'll keep on going. All right. So let's get into this part right here where Esther and Mordecai rise to judge. And the reason that I kind of uh, titled it that way is just sort of to kind of bring out the idea of, remember that after 3 days, she puts on her royal attire. Think about that. She puts on her royal attire after 3 days of fasting and having said, if I die, I die. And now she gets lifted up. Mordecai gets lifted up, and he's put on royal attire. And now they're going to be writing law. In other words, they're going to be adjudicating or judging. So it's, yeah, there's all these ideas of uh, not just rescue and salvation, but also ruling in this, right? Because and it's funny because the king has said, up to half my kingdom, and it's almost going to be as if half the kingdom is going to be put into their hands because they're going to be writing in the name of the king. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman. So that it's kind of like, yeah, if you have like the governor's mansion or something like that, or some place where an official is supposed to live, like you have that now. In other words, so Queen Esther is not just his queen bride who he can call whenever to sleep with or whatever, but she's now going to be in a position, kind of like Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. So Esther says, "Yeah, this is kind of like my cousin who's much older than me, and he raised me when my parents died." Kind of gives probably some of those details. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. This is the king's. This is like the king's signature, right? Like you can enact law and you can do things in proxy of the king. So this whole up to half my kingdom sort of thing is kind of coming true. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. In other words, he is now second in command, pretty much. He's the chief of the princes now. Mordecai is the chief of the princes now. Um, and the king was, and this is oh yeah, well, going back to the king had probably never met Mordecai before. Yeah, Mordecai's always been at the gate and everything, but I don't think they'd ever formally met. Maybe seen him like while he's riding by on his horse, but he doesn't know who he is. So Esther explains who he is. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite. They keep on pointing out Haman the Agagite and Mordecai the Jew, and the plot that had been devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. So again, she kind of took that risk of, not being, just appearing, but now she's got more clout, And she said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are on all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, so she's saying, can you change this law? Now, what he's going to say is like, you guys do what you need to do. So he says, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman. In other words, she is in, let's just say, the, vice regent's mansion. And they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. So here again, you have the parallel language of the king, of the edict that cannot be revoked, and it parallels the other mirror image of this structure. But yeah, what he's doing is saying, I've given you authority to write whatever you need to and whatever you want to in regard to this. In other words, you enact the law, you have the signet ring. I'm giving you the authority to do this. So they have been lifted up way up there, right? So it's a symmetrical antithesis. As Haman wrote a decree and it was spread out through the empire, now Mordecai and Esther will send out a decree to be spread out across the empire. So again, it's part of that mirror, right? The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the third month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. So now you have these it's another parallel, like where you're, first you had the Purim and they were cast and they came up to a certain day. Now it's recording the month and the day that they're going to that they've meeting here. There's no Purim being tossed here. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded. So Mordecai is commanding this concerning the Jews. So the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces to each. Now, this is just the same language, right? As like that first decree that Haman had written. This is the same, it's listing all the provinces and to everybody in their own language, and also the Jews in their script and language. So it's all, I think it might be for verbatim if I remember. Part of it is in any case. And he wrote in the name of the king Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from a royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend themselves, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. They have the right to plunder the goods. Remember that Haman commands everybody that like they're gonna that he all these people, you guys got to rise up and wipe out the Jews and plunder their goods, right? Now Mordecai's decree is like, yeah, and the Jews are allowed to kill and defend themselves and to unite any armed force that comes and plunder their goods. Okay. Um, on one day throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So this is applying to the same day. A copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree to every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in robes of blue and white and of great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. So it's just not ceremonial for one time that he was clothed and paraded on the streets. This is now the way he dresses. It's the norm now for Mordecai to dress this way. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. First time, here's another parallel, contrast of, is that first time the city of Susa was troubled, or they were perplexed or vexed by the first decrees, but now the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. So the Susaites actually kind of didn't like that first decree, and now they're actually happy about this second decree. So it's a parallel contrast to Susa being troubled at Haman's decree in chapter 3. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Holiday is Yom Tov. Actually, this is the first time, I believe, in the entire Old Testament where you have the word holiday, Yom Tov, come from. This is the I think the origination of the term Yom Tov. Anyway, I read that somewhere. And many of the people of the country declared themselves Jews. Now, this is interesting, okay? Many of the peoples from the country declared themselves Jews for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now, this appears to say something like, yeah, we don't want to be wiped out, so we're just going to say we're Jewish. Hey, not me, don't kill me, so, and because we think that the Jews are actually going to, but of course, here's the problem too, is that, yeah, but you're also going to be attacked by a bunch of other people. So I don't know. But the fear, so the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Here's what it says in the Septuagint. And many of the Gentiles were circumcised and lived in the Jewish way because of the fear of the Jews. So they actually became Jews. They declared themselves Jews. Now you can't just declare, okay, I'm Jewish now. They actually were if the man was circumcised, you would celebrate the Passover then from every year, and any wife that you were married to, your circumcision covered both of you. And as a woman, if you were married to somebody who was circumcised, or as a child, if you came in the household of the circumcised father, and if you were male were circumcised, then you were part of that community. That is how you become a Jew. So it's not like a thing like DNA, like the way that we think about it now. It's, do you follow this? Do you follow these ways? They lived in a Jewish way. It doesn't. Again, the whole story of Esther, on purpose, it looks like doesn't mention God, but you see God in everything. So living in the Jewish way meant that you have now abandoned your old gods and you've gone with a Yahweh, right? And the circumcision and living the Jewish way is you've become one of the people that does all of those things. It doesn't matter where you were from, you became an Israelite by adopting that way of life. It didn't matter if you were an Egyptian. It didn't matter if you were from Africa, from Asia, from Europe. It didn't matter. You became a Jew by practicing those things. And I think that's all there is today. So, but yeah, fear of the Jews. Now, it also kind of reminds me of the story of uh, what's her name? Rahab, the harlot
Oh,
in Jericho, right? Where she talks to the spies and she says, the fear of the Jews has come upon us. And we've heard about what was done to Pharaoh's army. And she helps the spies, which is actually she's being a traitor to her people, from her people's point of view. And she's being a traitor to her gods because she's saying, I'm no longer going to go with these gods of Jericho. I fear the God of the Hebrews, right? And and she becomes a Jew. So she's part of Israel, you know. She's switched teams. So and that's why she ends up in the lineage. You know, she's one of the foremothers of David and therefore Jesus. You know, so it's the making of the oaths. And, you know, like if you look at the people on the boat with Jonah and they made oaths to the Lord and stuff like that. Um, it doesn't say anything about it. You know, maybe it does in the Septuagint, but in my mind, yeah, they became Israel. They became Jewish. And that's a little bit like we think so much in terms of DNA. They didn't think about DNA. It's like what defined you. You were an Athenian because you participated in a collective life of the Athenians. It didn't matter what your skin color was. It's like that's what defined you was what people you were a part of, and what people you were a part of was we do these things and we believe these things and we practice this way of life. That's more or less what it is. And so it kind of helps explain in our modern mind. Um, I think, you know, we don't think that way anymore. We think in terms of DNA and all that kind of stuff, whatever. But it's just not, it doesn't really line up that well with the ancient ways of thinking. Declared themselves Jews. Well, I'm Jewish now, you know. And yeah, I like that. The Septuagint way of explaining it is like they got circumcised and they joined the Jewish way of life and they're Jews now. You know, I like that. So the Septuagint, I know Andre, you know all about this, but uh, the um, the translations that we have our Bibles from are mostly translated from the Masoretic text. Those were the texts that were put together over about 1,000. They were finished around 1,000 AD. So that's 1,000 years after Christ that the Masoretic text was put together. And before 19 the early 1900s, the early 20th century, where we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those were about the only and the oldest text that we have to translate into, say, English from, right? So like you have that's how you have King James used Masoretic text primarily. The thing with the Septuagint is that even though it's a Greek translation from the Hebrew, it was done 300 years before Christ. So it's not the original language, but it's much, much older than the Masoretic text. And what happened was, and strictly speaking, the Septuagint was just the first five books, the Torah. But then in the 100 years after that, so coming into about 200, up to 200 years before Christ, all of the rest of the Old Testament books were also translated into Greek. And so in a broader sense, we call those the Septuagint too. Now, what happened when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls was that was a community that had existed about 150 years before Christ. They had Hebrew texts and they had Septuagint texts. The Hebrew that they had was much older than the Masoretic text. So that's why it's such a treasure trove, because the texts that they were using were at least 150 years old, probably more like 200 years old, and maybe even 250 years before Christ. That's old. No, in other words, yeah, they would be 20. They'd be like 2,200 years old, right? Masoretic text is like 1,500 years old. So they're like, wow, this is much older, and we have some of it. We only have fragments of, but like in Genesis, they had like multiple copies of Genesis and stuff. So what they discovered was that the wording that they had in that much older Hebrew, a lot of times agreed more with the Septuagint than the Masoretic text did. So, so that's the importance of Septuagint. And so, like for me, I've decided to look up things a lot more into Septuagint, because you got to remember that the Masoretic text was being put together by Hebrew scholars after Christianity. So they were putting things, they were wording things in a way sometimes that hid um, things that would support the Christian's point of view on things. You see what I'm saying? It's ironic that the translations that we have, for the most part, are used, and that we still use them to that degree. But I think it's important for us um, uh, to maybe embrace the Septuagint a lot more. In the East, they only use the Septuagint, or that's for the English translations, I would say. And I can see why. Well, because they started using them before the Masoretic text was even done. So it's amazing sometimes what you find in Septuagint. You're going, wow, hung on a tree, huh? Okay, that seems to ring a bell for us Christians, things like that. So yeah, there's some real gems. Here's another one. Okay, like I found out this weekend, and I heard, um, or I heard the uh, I was at an Orthodox service, and because Rachel was being she was chrismated, that's anointed, but they were on Holy Saturday, because last Sunday was their Easter, right? Um, they um, they read the entire book of Jonah. They read the whole Daniel chapter 3. They read all of Isaiah 6. They read another whole chapter of Isaiah. And I'm going, what do these have to do with Holy Saturday? And of course, I'm thinking, oh, yeah, Jonah, because of his death and resurrection, right? They're like, as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, and here's the interesting thing, where it gets to the part of like where, Jonah preaches to them and says, and in the Masoretic text, it says, and in 40 days, God is going to destroy the city. In the Septuagint, it says 3 days. so so they're like so there's three sets of three in the Septuagint. You have 3 days in the belly of the, and it says sea monster. It doesn't say fish, right? And I looked up that word. It's a Greek word for sea monster. It's the word that Jesus uses when he says, when I, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the sea monster. That's like that's what he says, because the New Testament writers all use the Septuagint. So I'm going, okay, like this makes sense now. So, and then he takes a 3 day journey to Nineveh, and I'm thinking a 3 day journey is the time period where Abraham is bringing Isaac to be slaughtered, right? And in his mind, he's dead. So it's like a 3 days journey. So there's kind of like another death, and like, and then he says to them, in 3 days you're going to be killed. So in their mind, for 3 days they're dead, and so they're fasting, you know and then of course they're saved out of that, and quote unquote resurrected. And I'm going, this is so, like, as soon as I saw that, I didn't even notice it until I saw some note somewhere, like 3 days Esther, fasted, and now, and this is like referring to the resurrection. I'm going, yeah, of course, 3 days, so every time I see the 3 days something, I'm going to pay attention. Anyway, it's one of those little things. Any questions, comments? Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Sorry, Gary, can't hear you.
Now can you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll remember those 3 days now too.
Yeah, I'm be looking for them.
Other things, yeah.
Yeah.
How they parallel.
Yeah, all the story connections, and I'm like, sometimes I'm like, I don't know, but I'll make a note of them, put them in the back pocket later on, maybe see something. Anyway,
It is beautiful how everything points to his resurrection. I
yeah,
mean, so many different in
yeah,
different ways, symbolically,
yeah,
Yeah, it's all there.
not just physical.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like that's why, like, when Jesus was on the road to Emmaus, he explains to them from all of the law and the prophets, which just means like the Old Testament, these things, and he shows them all of these. He doesn't have to go into and this, when Isaiah had this prophecy and had this prophecy, he just tells a story. I think, remember when the Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days. Remember when, like they passed through the waters, and came out the other side on dry land, and it was a new day. Remember when Noah, was preserved through the calamities in the water, and all that, and yeah. Well, yeah, this Jesus, he rose after 3 days. Uh, he's telling them all those stories, and they're like, oh yeah, that connection, yeah, we're getting it now. And they had the Septuagint. So they're probably going, yeah, okay, yeah, I remember that wording. Hung on a tree and blah 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 blah. Yeah, okay, all these, yeah, it's amazing. So
Yeah.
In the name of Jesus, thank you, brother.
you're welcome.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, but I gotta go take medication. I'm in
That's
pain.
that's cool, man. Sorry.
Gentlemen,
Sorry.
ladies,
All right.
you guys have a
All right.
good evening. I'll
All
see
right.
you guys. Good night,
Okay.
everyone.
Good night.
I think I will at least stop recording.